A young man stands on the sun-bleached deck of a wooden merchantman, his eyes fixed intently on the low, dark line of the Virginia wilderness as it rises from the waters of the Chesapeake Bay. Behind him lies an old world of crowded cities, a rigid hierarchy of which he is not an honored part, and a long-claimed soil, a world that has denied him a place of honor because of the accident of his birth order. He's a younger son, cut off from his father's ancestral lands by the unyielding law of primogeniture, left with nothing but a modest handful of coin, a coat of arms, some family connections, and a fierce, burning ambition to become a member of the gentry in which his birth denied him a place. Before him stretches a vast, primeval world of endless forests, slow-moving rivers, and deep, untamed banks of clay and muck. In this wild and still mostly uncharted landscape, he does not see merely a temporary refuge or an opportunity for quick and volatile profit. Instead, he sees a blank canvas upon which he can paint the picture of his own baronial empire and make it a reality. He can erect a grand manor home along the banks of these muddy waters and establish a political dynasty that will echo through the centuries and history. He will become that which his birth would have denied him had he remained at home. This solitary figure is, of course, a composite of the more serious of the adventurers who arrived in Virginia's first decades with a dynastic goal in mind. But his ambitions accurately mirror the exact desires that drove the founders of Virginia's old political elite across the Atlantic Ocean. The men who formed the first families of Virginia did not cross the sea to escape civilization. They crossed it to rebuild civilization in their own image, turning the dangerous swamps, fields, and forests of the Virginia Tidewater and Piedmont into a stud farm of aristocratic power in the new continent. Over the course of the next century, from roughly 1640 to 1740, these ambitious immigrants systematically transformed themselves from displaced commoners and middling traders into a self-conscious, tightly knit oligarchy that completely dominated the economic, social, and political life of the Old Dominion. They built an insulated, intermarried society that lived handsomely on vast riverfront estates, each commanding thousands and generally even tens of thousands of acres in dozens or hundreds of human lives, developing that habit of command for which they were famous. These are the first families of Virginia, 20-odd extraordinary families who climbed the pinnacle of early American society and became the Virginia gentry of legend, the topping people. These are the names that formed the bedrock of the Virginia gentry and fill the pages of any proper history of colonial and early Republic America. Beverley, Burwell, Byrd, Carter, Corbin, Custis, Diggs, Fitzhughs, Grimes, Harrison, Jennings, Lee, Lewis, Lightfoot, Ludwell, Nelson, Page, Randolph, Robinson, Taylor, Washington, and Wormley. And of course, you have those families like the Jeffersons that married into them. Such are the families of Virginia legend in American history. Their stories are fascinating. As Evans writes in his book, A Topping People, quote, "The origins, growth, and influence of Virginia's upper class have long fascinated scholars and the wider public," end quote. Indeed. So, tracing the sweeping narrative arc of these planter princes, following their humble beginnings in the 17th century, the golden age of their baronial dominance in the 18th century, their transformation into revolutionary republicans, and their eventual twilight, is what we will do, generally, in this show, before we begin the narrative biographies of each great man from each of these families in the ensuing weeks. And, of course, those families connected to them. We wouldn't want to leave out the Madisons, the Jeffersons, and so on. So next week, or really this Saturday, we'll be starting with the dynasty of the Lees, the famous dynast who started their family. Stay tuned. That'll be fun. Welcome back to The Old World with Will Tanner, the show where we tell the tales of the great colonial adventurers, magnificent American and British families of the world that used to exist. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this video around if you like it. That's how we grow and keep this project going. Now, let's get into our history of the first families of Virginia, that topping bedrock of the Virginia gentry that did so much to propel not just the Old Dominion, but America forward. Strap in. It's going to be an exciting ride, full of fascinating history. For generations, a sentimental tradition wrapped the origins of Virginia's first families in the glittering fabric of the Cavalier myth. According to this myth, which does have some basis in fact, as we've discussed before, they claimed that the colony was settled by high-born English noblemen fleeing the radical puritanism of Oliver Cromwell's revolution and protectorate. There is some reason to think this. Governor Sir William Berkeley encouraged as many Cavaliers as could do so to flee from Britain to Virginia, of course, and his 3 decades in the Old Dominion, most of which were spent as the governor, saw the population explode from a miserable 8,000 to a mostly prosperous 40,000. A significant increase at the same time as he was encouraging Cavalier immigration. Yet further, there had been something of a change wrought in the culture and the people of the colony by the time he left. When he arrived in 1642, it was said, quote, that none but those of the meanest quality and corruptest lives went there, end quote. A couple decades later, a French Huguenot exile who moved to Virginia, Durand, remarked, quote, the gentlemen called Cavaliers are greatly esteemed and respected and are very courteous and honorable. They hold most of the offices in the country, end quote. So there would be some reason, at least, to think that many of the first family of Virginia dynasts were Cavaliers, particularly as nearly all of them arrived in this era, generally the 1640s, during the detested protectorate of Cromwell. Still, a fierce debate has raged over whether these FFV, I'll use the acronym going forward, dynasts were indeed Cavaliers, or if that is merely a legend. David Hackett Fisher, a proponent of the Cavalier legend in his famous Albion Seed, asserts, quote, the first gentlemen of Virginia were truly Cavaliers. They were not the pasteboard protagonists of Victorian fiction or the celluloid heroes of Gone with the Wind, but neither were they self-made bourgeois capitalists, modern agro-businessmen, upwardly mobile yeomen, or plain folk. Most were younger sons of proud Armigerous families with strong royalist politics, a devout Anglican faith, decided rural prejudices, entrenched manorial ideals, exalted notions of their own honor, and at least the rudiments of an Aristotelian education, end quote. He adds, quote, these distressed Cavaliers founded what would later be called the first families of Virginia. The American beginnings of Virginia's ruling families occurred within a decade of the year 1655. End quote. More specifically, quote, of 72 families in Virginia's high elite whose dates of migration are known, 2/3 arrived between 1640 and 1669. End quote. On the other hand, Clifford Doughty, famed historian of Virginia, asserts in his The Virginia Dynasties that, quote, the most beguiling myth to cover the obscure beginnings of the founders of the aristocracy was that of the Cavaliers, end quote. He adds that most of the FFV founders came before the Protectorate, thus diminishing their connection to the Cavalier legend, though they still could have been royalist in political orientation, as men like Richard Lee I, man who we'll be covering on Saturday, and who arrived in 1639, were. The reality appears to be a mix. The men who founded these legendary American Virginian dynasties were overwhelmingly the younger sons of the English rural gentry or aggressive, upwardly mobile merchants from the crowded lanes of London. Either way, the first family of Virginia founders were generally men with some starting capital, but not a great deal of it, and who wanted to better their situation and station in life, to become gentlemen by arriving in Virginia, and thus become a landed elite with a share in the governance of the empire. Many of them appear to have been of a Cavalier political orientation, meaning they generally supported the crown rather than Cromwell. Though they were, by and large, not the Cavaliers of legend, clad in knee-high leather riding boots with rapiers dangling at their hip and plumed feathers rising from their rakishly tilted caps. They were, instead, sharp-elbowed men on the make who wanted to become landed gentlemen, members of the gentry, and saw Virginia as the canvas on which they could paint that dream into reality. It's important to note here that the inheritance laws and folkways of 17th century England dominated this and led to this happening. Primogeniture, the family's desire to remain landed and in possession of a country seat, dictated that the eldest son inherited the entirety, or at least the vast majority, of the family estate, something generally accomplished at this point in history and later through the practice of entail, by which an estate was made non-alienable and non-divisible so that it would and could be passed in trust from one generation to the next, overwhelmingly intact, to the heir, leaving his younger brothers and sisters to generally fend for themselves in the worlds of trade, law, or military service. Some got a stipend out of the revenues of the family estate. Most daughters got a dowry. But on the whole, those who were younger had to make their way in the world rather than planning on inheriting much of note. So, cut off from ancestral lands, but imbued with the tastes and ambitions of their class, these younger sons viewed the vast expanse of the New World as a laboratory where individual effort could reconstruct the baronial status denied to them at home. As Evans writes in A Topping People, quote, "London merchants were a competitive, achievement-oriented lot as opposed to county families who in general had a disdain for trade." End quote. They, of course, these men coming to Virginia, even if they were coming from merchant backgrounds, very much wanted to have that country lifestyle. Yet further, their connections to the generally royalist gentry of Britain were no myth, even if they themselves came from merchant families that had once been younger sons, adding to the Cavalier connection. As Fisher notes, quote, "The great majority of Virginia's upper elite came from families in the upper ranks of English society. 152 Virginians who held top offices in the late 17th and early 18th century, at least 16 were connected to aristocratic families, and 101 were the sons of baronets, knights, and the rural gentry of England. 7 more came from the Armigerous urban families, with coats of arms at the College of Heralds. Only 18 were the sons of yeomen, traders, mariners, artisans, or plebs. None came to Virginia as laborers or indentured servants, except possibly the first Adam Thorogood, who was also the brother of a baronet. Only 2 were not British, and 9 could not be identified." End quote. These displaced sons arrived in the Chesapeake primarily between the years 1630 and 1680, as discussed before, carrying with them a modest amount of initial capital, a high degree of literacy, and invaluable networks of kinship and commercial connections back in the mother country. Governor Barclay remarked at the time that a small sum of money, education, connections were the 3 main requirements for a younger brother to erect a flourishing family in Virginia. Such is what these men, the FFV dynasts, had, and they used it to get ahead. For one, they used that capital to amass vast feudal domains of very cheap frontier land through aggressive manipulation of the colony's headright system, which granted 50 acres of land for every individual a planter transported across the Atlantic. We've discussed this before in our early episodes on the plantation system and tobacco. By financing the immigration of thousands of white indentured servants, or just by buying the headrights off of captains who brought those servants to the colonies, or figuring out how to use their political power to just buy large blocks of land, as tended to happen as the years went on. These ambitious newcomers systematically accumulated massive, contiguous blocks of prime riverfront territory with richer soil that could grow the best strains of tobacco, and from which it was much easier to ship hogsheads of tobacco, adding to their profits. These early land acquisitions grew to an extraordinary scale over consecutive generations. The first generation patented an aggregate of nearly 250,000 acres of pristine, prime Virginia tobacco soil, but those generations that followed them patented far more. Robert King Carter, for example, eventually amassed an empire exceeding 300,000 acres. William Fitzhugh consolidated a barony of 56,000 acres, actually a few more than that, and Richard Lee I held upwards of 16,000 acres of prime tobacco land when he passed away. He's, of course, the first of these FFV dynasts to really get his start in a big way in Virginia. Yet, contrary to modern popular perception, many of these families did not immediately depend on the cultivation of the soil for their ascension. In fact, they built the foundations of their fortunes through aggressive mercantile establishments, namely frontier trade and riverine trade with Britain, and the mastery of public office. At least 15 of the primary 22 families we're discussing here were deeply involved in trade or originated from prosperous commercial backgrounds. For example, William Byrd I, the son of a London goldsmith, secured the bedrock of his family's wealth, not behind a plow or by growing tobacco, but by operating an aggressive frontier trading post at the falls of the James River, where he exchanged English manufactured goods for precious skins and furs brought in by Indian traders. Richard Lee I similarly acted as an energetic merchant trader. That's why he came across to Virginia. He was sent there by his family, or so legend goes, brokering transactions between London tobacco houses and local planters. The capital he earned was shifted into land and focused primarily upon tobacco cultivation, but it got its start with this mercantile background. Most of the great planters ran trading posts of a sort that allowed them to accumulate the tobacco of small farmers, which they could then ship to Britain on more advantageous terms, in exchange for selling those farmers manufactured goods and farm supplies from England. These men were versatile opportunists in the economy. They operated sawmills, they ran grist mills, they worked as attorneys very frequently, and they leased land to tenants, doing anything and everything they could to accelerate their accumulation of capital that could then be poured into more land and more slaves or servants to work it. In the closing decades of the 17th century, this emerging elite moved away from its early reliance on white indentured servants, kind of to go back to that slaves versus servant points from a moment ago, and turned instead towards the use of imported African slaves. This shift was accelerated and really propelled along by the social unrest that came with Bacon's rebellion in 1676, which we've covered before, as that rebellion made them unwilling to bring over indentured servants who might again rise in a similar revolt. And, of course, the punishing effects of the Navigation Acts, as we've also discussed before, came to play here as well. By restricting the sale of colonial tobacco exclusively to English ports, the Navigation Acts artificially depressed the price of the tobacco crop, causing it to frequently drop below 1 pence per pound for a period of about 2 decades at the end of the 17th century. To survive these brutally low prices and, of course, the lower profit margins that came with them, the large planters realized that they had to shift to a system of massive volume production. It was the only way they could make money. This required a cheaper, permanent, and more easily controlled labor force, hence slavery. So planters who possessed significant liquid capital, as the first families of Virginia and other members of the Virginia gentry generally did, used that capital to buy enslaved workers, dramatically increasing their tobacco output as they patented more land as well. Through this, they managed to make a profit, remain in power. They also systematically froze out the smaller independent farmers, cementing their status at the apex of Virginia society. As they consolidated this vast material wealth, these families also consolidated an effective monopoly over the colony's political structures. They systematically captured the local county courts, the parish vestries, and the officer ranks in the colonial militia, ensuring that every level of local governance was directed by their own kin. They were intermarried families, after all. This localized control served them well as it created not just local dominance, but also a political pipeline to the House of Burgesses and, most importantly, the prestigious Council of State, the 12-man oligarchy, essentially, that was appointed directly by the monarch, often, though, at the request of certain elements within Virginia and the governor himself. Members of this council combined their supreme executive, legislative, and judicial powers into one, serving as effectively the upper house of the assembly and a court of last resort, the province, the Supreme Court, if you will. They also aggressively built their fortunes through these positions. So this dynamic began early on under the long governorship of Governor Sir William Berkeley, who consistently rewarded newly arrived dynasts of the sort we're discussing, men who had superior education, learning, and gentry or at least genteel backgrounds with lucrative administrative posts. So by the dawn of the 18th century, public office had become something that was effectively an inherited piece of family property. though it wasn't legally recognized as such. And these grandees dominated the vestry, the courts, the burgesses, the council, and the remunerative positions within the state, such as Auditor General, Secretary of State, Naval Customs Collector, on it goes. They used the administrative machinery of the empire to continually add to their own estates, patenting more and more rich land and using their posts within government not only to accumulate the capital, with which they did so as they were paid for these posts, but also by making sure that their patents got approved. To map the geography of the state to the power centers in early Virginia is to generally follow the long and winding paths of the great rivers that sliced through the coastal tidewater plain. These deep and navigable waters, over about 45,000 miles of coastline, as is commented upon in a great book called Tobacco Coast, allowed the ocean-going merchant vessels of London and Bristol generally to sail directly up to the private wharves of individual plantations, particularly those of the big planters, rendering the development of large commercial cities unnecessary. This helped turn the massive estates of the large planters, like the FFVs, into what amounted to baronial fiefdoms. All the small planters had to rely on them to get their tobacco onto ships, which proved very valuable. So let's discuss those fiefdoms and the families that ran them in broad detail, using so to discuss the famous families, some of the more famous members, and where they lived and what they did in their backgrounds. So for now, I'm just going to do a very broad overview of most of these families and what they accomplished to paint a picture of what the FFV class was like. But remember, in future episodes, I'll be going through each of these families individually, starting with the Lees, and doing biographies of each of the great men kind of along the generations. So to start along the banks of the James River, the early economic heartland of the colony, the Randolphs established an empire of unprecedented genealogical influence. Originating from a line of Warwickshire, County Gentry, William Randolph arrived in Virginia in 1670, establishing a modest seat at Turkey Island. Alongside his wife, Mary Isham, he orchestrated a series of brilliant alliances for his children through marriage, earning the couple the historical moniker of the Adam and Eve of Virginia. Through later carefully calculated generational matches with the Bowling family, for example, the Randolphs secured a blood connection to Pocahontas herself through her son Thomas Rolfe. Similarly, matrimonial alliances made the Randolphs not just a wealthy family with numerous estates all along the James, but a real factory of American statesmanship. They eventually produced, through one line, Thomas Jefferson. They also produced Chief Justice John Marshall and the brilliant, eccentric John Randolph of Roanoke, whose biography I can't wait to get to name but a few members of the extended Randolph clan. Adjacent to the Randolph domain sat the vast estate of the Byrds. The first William Byrd arrived before 1670 from a line of prosperous London goldsmiths. He was sent across the Atlantic to live with his wealthy but childless uncle, a merchant planter named Thomas Stegg. Upon Stegg's death in 1671, young Byrd inherited an established, highly lucrative trading post located directly at the falls of the James River. Byrd I used this trading post to construct a massive fortune through the Indian trade, shipping many thousands of furs and skins to England, while simultaneously engaging quite heavily in the early slave trade, from which he also made a very large fortune. Many of those profits were poured into land and the development of a landed estate, and his son, William Byrd II, often described as an ornament of colonial Virginia, transformed this commercial wealth into being a cultural authority. He constructed the magnificent brick mansion of Westover and collected a massive library of thousands of volumes. When he died, he left hundreds of thousands of acres to his son, William Byrd III, but this immense fortune carried the seeds of its own destruction, as William Byrd III was notoriously one who succumbed to the vices of extravagance and high-stakes gambling in particular, driving the family into financial ruin. It was a catastrophe, and forcing the liquidation of their properties on the eve of revolution, the American Revolution, that is, in lotteries. It was disaster. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations could be as true in the Old Dominion as in Gilded Age New York, it appears. Farther down the James, the Harrisons carved out a legacy of agrarian and political prominence, arriving from Northamptonshire in 1632, so one of the earlier families on the list. They built the historic Berkeley plantation, which was originally Berkeley 100. We've discussed the distinction between plantations and hundreds before. In any case, Benjamin Harrison II and Benjamin Harrison III systematically expanded their holdings to encompass about 20,000 acres of land and over 80 slaves by the opening decade of the 18th century. This family line produced Benjamin Harrison V, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the more conservative founders, along with two future presidents of the United States, William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison. The James River elite was rounded out by the fierce, politically combative Ludwell clan. Originating in Somerset, the first Philip Ludwell arrived in Virginia, 1648, to join his influential brother, Thomas. The Ludwells were unapologetic royalists who quickly wormed their way into the circle of Governor Sir William Berkeley. Following Berkeley's death, Philip Ludwell I executed a brilliant matrimonial maneuver by marrying the governor's wealthy widow, Lady Frances Culpeper Stevens Berkeley. She's remembered as Lady Frances for obvious reasons, given her long name. This marriage brought the iconic Green Spring estate, which had the colony's first manor home, into the possession of the Ludwell family, and this gave them a powerful geographic base from which they repeatedly launched ferocious political wars against a succession of subsequent royal governors who dared to infringe upon the privileges of the gentry class. Eventually, the Ludwells married into the Lee family, and this estate ended up in Lee hands, but more on that in a future episode. Moving northward to the peninsula, in the valley of the York River, the Burwells illustrated the tight, oligarchic nature of the Tidewater elite. Arriving from Bedfordshire in 1640, they eventually constructed the breathtaking mansion of Carter's Grove. It really is beautiful. The Burwells focused their energies on the accumulation of land, the continuous consolidation of family alliances. Lewis Burwell II managed an estate of about 17,000 acres scattered across 4 counties, and he left massive cash bequests to his children when he died in 1710. This family intermarried so heavily with neighboring dynasties that by the opening of the 18th century, Governor Francis Nicholson complained bitterly to authorities in London that the Burwells and their cousins practically controlled the Council of State, rendering it impossible for him, a royal governor, to enforce imperial policy without their consent. It kind of shows the power of these FFV types when they set their minds to something. Adjacently, on the peninsula, sat the twin dynasties of the Pages and Nelsons. The Pages, originating from Middlesex, arrived in 1650, while the Nelsons, springing from Cumberland, arrived much later. They arrived in 1705. The Pages represented the apex of Virginia's architectural ambition as they constructed Rosewell in Gloucester County, which is was a colossal 3-story brick palace that was widely reputed to be the largest and most architecturally sophisticated mansion in all of colonial America. But it carried with it a staggering cost, and maintaining this massive structure proved to be an exhausting financial drain on the family, effectively impoverishing future generations of them. But it was a very impressive mansion. In contrast, the Nelsons built their empire upon the foundations of Yorktown commerce. The immigrant Thomas Nelson established a highly successful mercantile house, importing British manufactured goods and exporting tobacco on a massive scale. This commercial fortune, built in Yorktown primarily, directly financed the career of his descendant, Thomas Nelson Jr., who used his family's liquid wealth, which was immense, even compared to other planters, to bankroll the state's militia during the Revolutionary War, and he proudly added his signature to the Declaration of Independence. However, their involvement in the Revolution somewhat bankrupted the family. It was certainly a financial drain on them. The Pages and the Nelsons intermarried quite heavily over multiple generations, kind of tying the two families together. Along the banks of the Rappahannock River and the reaches of Middlesex County, the Carters were one of the most famous FFV families, one of the largest, one of the wealthiest by far, and they reached a level of affluence that just defied comparison for other families. Believed to have originated as successful London vintners. They arrived in Virginia in 1635. The family achieved every immigrant's baronial dreams under the next generation, Robert King Carter, a man whose economic acumen and ruthless land speculation made him the single wealthiest individual in colonial North America. Carter served as the longtime agent for the Northern Neck Proprietary, a massive royal land grant that eventually ended up in the hands of the Fairfax family. As the longtime agent of this Northern Neck Proprietary, Carter systematically directed the finest tracts of land into the hands of his own children. At his death in 1732, his estate included over 300,000 acres of land, a workforce of 1,000 slaves, and massive cash balances with London mercantile houses that routinely exceeded 5,000 pounds sterling, which was a huge sum at the time, particularly for a Virginia planter. Carter used this massive fortune to build separate, magnificent plantation seats for each of his numerous sons. He established the lines and the fortunes behind some of Virginia's most famous plantation homes, such as Nominee Hall, Sabine Hall, and Shirley. Sharing Rappahannock and that area were the Beverleys and the Wormleys, both hailing from the rugged hills of Yorkshire. Arriving in 1663, the first Robert Beverley combined his duties as a colonial surveyor and clerk of the House of Burgesses to patent almost 28,000 acres of really choice soil. His descendants maintained his intellectual and administrative bent. His son, Robert Beverley II, authored the first native-born history of the colony in 1705. It's actually a book that's cited a ton in most histories of Virginia, while his grandson, William Beverley, engaged in massive land speculation in the backcountry, patenting the historic, famous, well over 100,000 acre Beverly Manor tract in Augusta County to seat hundreds of newly arrived Scots-Irish immigrants. It actually worked reasonably well for what it was. The Wormleys, seated since 1636 at their lavish estate of Rosegill, chose to manifest their power through the characteristic Virginia planter display of both hospitality and luxury. So Rosegill served as a virtual second home for successive royal governors. The Wormleys were generally a loyalist family when Revolution came, and the governors liked to travel down the river to escape the heat of Williamsburg and enjoy the Wormleys' massive library, fine silver plate, beautifully manicured gardens. They lived in luxury. Along the northernmost frontier of the Tidewater, stretching between the Rappahannock and the Potomac rivers, lay the Northern Neck. That proprietary region we talked about with Carter, that was dominated by the Lee family. Sprung from a line of Shropshire country gentry who had entered the cloth trades of London because of the younger son connection we described earlier, Richard Lee I arrived in Virginia in 1639. So he wasn't the earliest one to arrive, but he was one of the earliest men of great prominence to arrive. Richard Lee I was quite respected. He was also a tireless entrepreneur, rapidly accumulating vast tracts of land along multiple counties while serving as clerk of the court and secretary of state. In the early 18th century, Thomas Lee consolidated family power. He was of the third generation of Lees and used his profits as a land agent, again, for the Northern Neck Proprietary. He took that away from King Carter, which caused some feuding between the families, to construct Stratford Hall, perhaps the most famous of Virginia plantation mansion homes. It's a colossal 8-shaped brick fortress. It's not very pretty, but it is quite dominating. It has 2-foot thick brick walls, for example, and it sat high upon the cliffs, the bluffs overlooking the Potomac River. This stark and imposing structure produced an extraordinary band of brothers later on during the Revolutionary Crisis and American Revolution itself. These included Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, both of whom would sign the Declaration of Independence, along with William and Arthur Lee, both of whom were deeply involved with our negotiations in France, Spain, and elsewhere. Another Lee line that branched off earlier, called the Lee-Sylvania Lees after their plantation, married back into the Lees of Stratford Hall with Light Horse Harry Lee, and this laid the track that led to General Robert E. Lee, probably the most famous of the Lees. The Potomac was also shared with the Fitzhughs, who were really the quintessential example of a mercantile background transforming into a real baronial aristocracy that lasted for a very long time. William Fitzhugh I, the seventh and last son of a modest Bedford woolen draper, migrated to the colony with little more than legal training and a few connections. It was enough. Through unceasing labor as an attorney, tobacco planter, and a wholesale merchant, Fitzhugh built a monumental estate. When he died in 1700, he held about 56,000 acres of land, a workforce of 51 slaves and 7 indentured servants, and an enormous inventory of expensive silver plate and English luxury coaches, demonstrating to the mother country that even a woolen draper's son could live like a lord in the forests of America. His descendants, like the Carters, remained exceedingly wealthy well into the 19th century, unlike many of the FFVs. Finally, isolated along the waters of the Chesapeake Bay and the flat, windswept landscape of the eastern shore, the Custises carved out a wealthy, somewhat eccentric domain originating from Gloucestershire, but arriving being the merchant houses of Rotterdam in 1650. They built the historic estate of Arlington. John Custis II and John Custis IV were notoriously cantankerous, which is where the eccentric reputation comes from. They were very difficult men. They did also accumulate vast fortunes through customs collecting, agriculture, and maritime trade. Following the death of Daniel Parke Custis, his immense estate passed in the hands of his young widow, Martha Dandridge Custis, who would subsequently marry a rising young Virginia colonel named George Washington, himself a member of an FFV seated in the Northern Neck, ultimately transferring a substantial portion of the old Custis fortune into the hands of the future commander-in-chief, who really held it in trust for Martha's kids. And this cemented a lineage that eventually connected back to the Lees, who inherited Arlington shortly before the Civil War, then lost it during the war when it was confiscated. Things changed as the 18th century began. The first generations of the immigrant elite had successfully passed away, leaving their vast estates, which they had accumulated and succeeded in so doing, in the hands of a genteel, Virginia-born aristocracy. These heirs, the men who created Virginia's golden age, weren't men who needed to look back to England with anxious eyes of strangers. They viewed themselves as Englishmen. They studied in England. They saw themselves as being English, but they also saw themselves as being the natural rulers of their prosperous provincial society. They saw themselves as Virginians as well. And so to preserve their hard-won material wealth and keep their political monopoly from fracturing, these great Virginia families, much like the English aristocracy of the time, intermarried to a great degree, and they turned Virginia politics into what amounted to an insulated family business. They bound themselves together in a vast, dense web of kinship that effectively turned the Tidewater gentry into one single extended cousinage. The metrics of this familial consolidation are extraordinary. The sons and daughters of 19 of the primary 21 families Emory Evans covers in his A Topping People study of the Virginia gentry married directly into at least one of the other elite lineages in the study, with the Wormleys and the Corbins consistently leading the matrimonial ledger. And many families, great and small alike, trying to marry into the land-rich Carter clan. So, by the early 1700s, 5 members of the Corbin family had married a Lee, a Taylor, a Wormley, a Lightfoot, and a Jennings, while 3 Wormley siblings married a Taylor, a Page, and a Corbin. As Evans writes in The Topping People, quote, Governor Nicholson explained this development well in 1701 when he wrote that newcomers had difficulty finding widows or maids of any fortune for wives because the natives, for the most part, get them, for they begin to have a sort of aversion to others, calling them strangers. End quote. This process intensified to such an advanced degree by mid-century that first cousins routinely married to keep estates from being split apart, creating a society where practically every member of the House of Burgesses was, in some capacity at least, related by blood or marriage to the men sitting on the Council of State. Very intermarried. This isolation fueled a brilliant 30-year golden age of luxury and cultural display that was specifically designed to mirror the lifestyle of the English country gentry. These were Cavalier-minded families, after all, who had deep ties to the British gentry and who set themselves up in Virginia to become gentlemen in the English mold. So between 1720 and 1750, the planter princes abandoned their modest 17th century timber dwellings and turned to a massive, monumental wave of brick building all across the colony. They were gentry now, with large estates at their command, and they used these estates to their advantage. They built grand, symmetrical Georgian mansions, as we've discussed before, complete with all the trappings, white marble central halls, end pavilions, expansive arcades that looked out over the great tidal rivers whose shores they ruled like the barons of old. They filled these spacious homes with expensive imported Persian rugs, silk draperies, Turkish rugs and chairs, London-made mahogany furniture, delicate Chinese porcelain, thousands of ounces of engraved family silver plate, which they saw as being a smart way of investing spare money into something other than land and something that could be used as a form of display. So silver served multiple purposes in their society. They dressed their households in the absolute latest, most expensive London fashions. They ordered custom coaches and six from British builders, and they spent what leisure hours they had. Tobacco, after all, was a more demanding mistress than a grain estate in England, traveling from estate to estate, drinking, feasting, and engaging in card games that lasted well into the wee hours of the morning. They also made a habit of gambling heavily on purebred horses at local county racetracks. Yet beneath the glittering, elegant service of this baronial lifestyle lay a profound and systematic economic trap. To maintain their level of competitive social display, successive generations of the gentry increasingly abandoned the active, diversified business habits of their merchant grandfathers, choosing instead to adopt the idealized role of the detached country gentleman who disdained active trade as vulgar. They became entirely dependent, more or less, upon the single, volatile cash crop of tobacco, and thus the mercy of British merchant houses to finance their luxury consumption. Some avoided this, like Washington, Robert Carter, Nominee Hall, but most fell into this tobacco trap. As Evans writes in The Topping People, quote, Virginia planters were prisoners of the system and subject to a price per pound of the weed over which they had little or no control. End quote. So they routinely drew massive lines of credit on merchants in London and Glasgow, putting themselves in a level of debt from which they found it near impossible to escape, particularly after 1730, as the soil of many of the old tidewater plantations began to suffer from soil exhaustion due to generations of intensive tobacco cultivation. Because the majority of these estates were strictly entailed, a legal mechanism that enforced primogeniture and legally prevented the sale or transfer of family land and slaves more or less forever, the gentry found themselves generally unable to liquidate their properties to clear their mounting debts, which in any case would have meant their disappearance as a gentry anyway. Many also failed to successfully switch to growing grain or to curtail their spending, both of which were much larger problems than the soil. Robert Carter of Nominee Hall, George Washington, and others showed that even in the late 18th century and on, a planter who was prudent could remain wealthy and generally out of debt while maintaining himself in dignity. He just had to remain carefully attentive to his plantation and his accounts and be willing to experiment with things like grain. But many did not do so, particularly of the upper levels of the gentry. They were trapped in a cage of their own making. They're owners of vast principalities and hundreds of slaves, yet they were chronically short on cash and increasingly buried under mountains of debt that threatened their independent status and personal honor. So by the time of Revolution, they were in debt to British merchants to the tune of £2 million, an unimaginably vast sum in those days. Indeed, by the 1760s, the financial crisis confronting the Virginia gentry had reached a dangerous flashpoint as British merchant houses, facing a credit crunch of their own at home, began to aggressively call in colonial debts and charge very steep interest rates. This economic pressure coincided with Parliament's decision to abandon its policy of salutary neglect and impose direct internal taxes, like the Stamp Act of 1765, upon the colonies. To the debtor planters of the Tidewater, this imperial overreach was a catastrophe. It was viewed as a fatal existential assault upon their personal independence, upon their rights as Englishmen. And as they saw it, if a distant parliament could arbitrarily tax their properties and drain the colony of its remaining currency by requiring payment in specie, as it did, the independent country life they had cultivated for over a century would be reduced to a state of absolute political and financial dependency. For those who are interested in this, we covered this in much more depth in our episode entitled How Virginia's Greatest Men Began the American Revolution in 1766. In any case, driven by this threat, this traditionally conservative landowning elite underwent a really radical transformation, at least for them, stepping forward to become the unlikely vanguard of the American Revolution. Because these families had spent a century practicing the habit of command within their estates, the county courts, the House burgesses, they possessed the trust and deference of the lower and middling classes of Virginia society. So they were trusted to launch a revolution, but they didn't do so via the French style, a chaotic, destabilizing social revolution from below. Instead, they led a structured, legally minded defiance led by those at the top. So revolutionary leaders like Richard Henry Lee and Landon Carter mobilized the population across the state, drafting radical, for the time, manifestos like the Westmoreland Resolves, 1766, and writing powerful public essays that successfully directed the anger of the populace, not at local class grievances, but instead against the authority of the British Crown. So they risked everything, their brick mansions, their thousands of acres, their necks, on a high-stakes gamble for independence, part of which was also motivated by their Western land holdings, which the British were trying to cut them off from. And they successfully led the colony through a long, exhausting war without suffering a radical overturning of the domestic social order at home, mostly. But while the revolution secured their political liberty, it did ultimately shatter the material foundations of their wealth. For one, the long years of the war permanently disrupted the old Atlantic trade routes, but also post-revolution, or really mid-revolution, legal reforms engineered by reformers like Thomas Jefferson struck a blow to the continuity of the old elite by abolishing entail and primogeniture. This, in turn, dismantled the feudal legal protections that had kept the great family estates intact for generations. And without these restrictions, the massive tidewater principalities were rapidly chopped up, divided equally among numerous sons and daughters, or aggressively liquidated by state courts to satisfy the lingering claims of pre-war British creditors. Some estates and families survived. Many, however, did not. The Golden Age was well and truly over. The consequence of all this was a melancholy twilight for the old dynasties as the 19th century dawned. Soil exhaustion and low tobacco prices rendered the old tobacco fields of the coastal plain generally unprofitable, forcing families to choose between going bankrupt, growing grain, or joining the massive westward migration. Hundreds of the younger sons of the first families of Virginia packed their remaining belongings and abandoned the tidewater. Even some established family members and families did as well, moving across the Blue Ridge Mountains into the Piedmont, or moving even farther and going to the backcountry of Kentucky, Tennessee, starting their lives over as pioneer farmers on a large scale, as their ancestors had done. And so by the 1820s and 1830s, most of the great architectural monuments of the Golden Age had fallen into a state of ghost-like disrepair and ruin. The roofs of the brick palaces like Stratford Hall, lost by Light Horse Harry Lee, leaked. The grand central halls were empty. The family burial grounds were swallowed up by swiftly readvancing forests. The tragic physical transformation of the landscape was captured with haunting, elegaic clarity by John Randolph of Roanoke during a melancholy visit to his ancestral Tidewater birthplace in the 19th century. When he visited, he found what he described as desolation and stillness, as if of death. The fires of hospitality long since quenched, the hearth cold, and the parish church tumbling to pieces, not more from natural decay than sacrilegious violence, declaring it to be a faithful picture of the state from the falls of the great river to the seaboard. The old gentry had disappeared. By the eve of the Civil War, the original families, 20-odd topping people in Virginia, had lost virtually all of their political and economic dominance. They were outvoted by the rising democratic population of the western counties, and were replaced by a new elite of professional lawyers, of merchants, and industrial entrepreneurs. Only a few, namely the Carters and the Fitzhughs, held on to anything approaching the old ways of life, and they were far less powerful than they had once been. Yet, the ultimate legacy of the planter princes of Virginia the first families of Virginia and the gentry they led, it wasn't necessarily the preservation of their brick manners or the survival of their wealth, but in the American Republic that they had created. The unique baronial culture of the Virginia gentry, the culture that combined an unyielding, fierce devotion, personal independence, and hegemonic liberty with an inherited habit of command, both politically and personally, successfully nurtured the intellectual giants who birthed the United States. It was this provincial aristocracy, operating from their isolated riverfront estates, that articulated the foundational principles of American liberty at the time and led the effort to put such ideals into practice, as they did in the early republic. Lewis B. Wright notes this best, doing so in his The First Gentleman of Virginia. He says, quote, "The tight little aristocracy that developed in Virginia in the later years of the 17th century quickly gained a power and influence far in excess of the numerical importance of its members, who were vastly outnumbered by the yeoman class. Planter aristocrats ruled Virginia as by prescriptive right, and from the ranks of their descendants came statesmen who helped weld 13 colonies into a nation." End quote. Indeed, it is those great men and the dynasties that created them that we have to thank for our republic. That is their legacy. That is the legacy of the first families of Virginia. Thank you for listening to this introductory episode to our First Families series. I'm very excited about this. It's why I started the channel, actually. And the introductory work I've been doing about Virginia has led to this point. So I'm very excited to start the series, starting next time with the first Lee family member, Richard Lee I, which I'm very excited about. His story is fascinating, and I think all the ones that follow will be fascinating as well. So make sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Make sure to like this video and share it around if you haven't already. Make sure to leave a comment letting me know what you think and about who you would like to hear. And we'll get into it next time. So thank you again for listening. I really do appreciate it. And I shall see you on Saturday with an episode on the Lee family.